Thanks, Bern.
Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to the Elsevier Engineering webinar series. We hope that you, your family, and colleagues are all safe and well during these challenging times. My name is Mark Petrachko. I'm a customer consultant for Western US Corporate for the Elsevier Engineering team. I'm today's moderator for today's session, Pathways to Net Zero. Before we get started, I'd like to launch a brief poll that will give us a little bit of information about who's attending today. If you could just take a brief second to answer those questions, I'd appreciate it. During today's session, please write your questions in the question and answer queue, which we will then answer at the end of the session as time allows. But it's my privilege today to introduce our two Elsevier panelists, Anne Gabriel. She's a Senior Vice President, and Dr. Basak Candemir. Anne Gabriel is a Senior Vice President for Global Strategic Networks at Elsevier. Anne and her global team engage with key stakeholders across the research enterprise to establish strategic collaborations and to use analytics and data to address societal challenges in the areas of sustainability, diversity, and inclusion, and open science. Anne has held a variety of positions in scholarly communication, including serving as publishing director of Elsevier's journal portfolio in engineering and computer science. Dr. Basak Candemir is a business development director for Elsevier Research Analytics and Data Service team. And prior to that, she led the analytical service team for both Europe and emerging markets. Basak has extensive experience conducting research performance analysis for the research leaders across the world using combined qualitative and quantitative analysis with a heavy focus on bibliometrics in the last years. Prior to joining Elsevier, she worked as the first Science and Innovation Officer in Turkey as part of the US Science and Innovation Network, the UK Science and Innovation Network, facilitating bilateral research and innovations that links between the UK and Turkey. Basak holds a doctorate in science and technology policies from the University of Sussex. Without further ado, I would like to turn the presentation over to Anne and Basak. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for that kind introduction. Hello, everyone, and welcome. As Mark noted, I'm Anne Gabriel, and with me is Dr. Basak Candemir. And I'm based in New York. Basak is based in Amsterdam, and we are delighted to be partnering today with you virtually for this webinar to share Elsevier's important and urgent work on net zero. I'm going to provide some brief background and context for our work in this area, and then Basak will share some of the data sources, methodology, and most importantly, key findings from the report. Next slide, if we may. Elsevier has long been engaged with the question of sustainability and the Sustainable Development Goals. We know that we need to make the world more equitable and sustainable. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals provides a blueprint as to how this might be achieved. Launched in 2015, the 17 goals covered the burning issues and challenges faced by society, and with a deadline to achieve these by 2030. Yet at the start of 2020, we were off track. At the current rate of progress, it would take 257 years to close the gender pay gap. And for an issue as serious as climate, we were on track for a more than 3-degree increase in global temperatures. Urgent action was needed, and the United Nations issued a decade of action using the next 10 years to accelerate progress towards a more sustainable future for both planet and people. Research and innovation are critical elements to reaching these targets, and Elsevier and the research communities we serve started to think through, are we doing the right science? And more fundamentally, are researchers incentivized to make progress? Next slide. Elsevier have taken a holistic, triple-pronged approach to both support and implement the SDG framework. We began in 2016 with publication of a series of pro bono analytical reports. The reports map more than 80 million scientific publications across the SDG framework. We are making every effort to walk the talk and make real changes to our business in order to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2040 and establish an inclusive culture within our company and also on our more than 2,500 scientific editorial boards. More importantly, we have also integrated the SDG framework into analytical tools, which the Academy, policymakers, and funders can use to track output and impact of research as the author, institutional, and country level. For example, Elsevier has partnered with Times Higher Education World University Rankings on measures of societal impact based on the SDGs. Next slide. Elsevier has developed a series of definitions and taxonomies to define topic areas for each of the SDGs and applied these to our abstracting and indexing databases of more than 80 million scientific publication records. This has allowed us to perform many insightful comparatives using the SDG framework. For example, we can map the Global Relative Activity Index for countries and institutions across the SDGs. Here, we compare the US and China, and we see significant differences in the areas of focus for each of the SDGs. The United States has significantly higher relative activity for SDG 5, gender equality, 10, reduced inequalities, and 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. China's highest area of relative activity is SDG 7, affordable and clean energy, which underscores the urgency for accelerating research in the area with a focus on net zero in particular. Next slide. In addition to mapping the landscape of research, we are looking for ways to apply this knowledge, and we've been working with research communities to promote awareness and adoption of the SDG frameworks, which is essential for operationalizing sustainability. I will share just a few examples of how our work in this area has been deployed. I mentioned previously our data is used for the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings, and it draws on SDG publication metrics in addition to universities' own data. This helps universities globally become engaged with SDG-driven impact rankings. We also support adoption of SDG frameworks on faculty profiling platforms, for example, Arizona State University's peer instantiations. This helps researchers to identify and classify those most active in areas of SDGs. More broadly, we also see institutional reviews adapting the SDG framework independently. For example, UC Davis's recent voluntary review of the Sustainable Development Goals, which highlights achievement and areas for development and fosters similar initiatives at peer institutions. Next slide. Further to this engagement, Elsevier is working closely with partners to support data-driven approaches to operationalizing the SDGs. In 2021, we participated in the Nobel Prize Summit, Our Planet, Our Future, together with the US National Academies. Subsequently, our SDG analyses have been presented at the National Academy Subcommittee sessions on operationalizing sustainable development. A specific focus of these sessions is net zero and carbon capture research. Next slide. The United States has set its own goals for net zero. Addressing the climate crisis requires immediate and sustained investment to eliminate net global greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century, and this presents a transformational opportunity for the United States and the world. Investing in clean technologies, infrastructure, workforce, and systems of the future creates an unprecedented opportunity to improve quality of life and create vibrant, sustainable, resilient, and equitable economies. In light of this urgency, the United States has set a goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by no later than 2050. Next slide. Some final comments before we turn to the analyses. The world is facing an unprecedented threat. Rising greenhouse gas emissions from burning fossil fuels and deforestation are leading to global heating that is destabilizing the climate, putting lives, livelihood, and entire ecosystems at risk. And the path to achieving this goal is not always clear and straightforward. According to the International Energy Agency, the IEA, developing and deploying clean energy technologies is critical to achieving net zero by the agreed deadline of 2050. In practical terms, achieving net zero globally will require a two-pronged approach, curbing human-produced emissions and removing carbon from the atmosphere. Many countries have already committed to reach some form of net zero by 2050. And as the world comes to terms with the effects of COVID-19, society's understanding of and response to the looming climate crisis will gain pace. The development and deployment of clean energy entails far more than just technological advancement. The scope of relevant research is enormous, encompassing solar, wind, bioenergy, and other clean energy sources. The economics of electric power systems, infrastructure, energy storage, batteries for electric vehicles, smart home technologies, data security and privacy, to name but a few. Actually, I think I named many. All of these elements are critical to ensuring that clean energy plays the required role. In addition, a successful transition to net zero will require engagement of corporates, government policies, and intergovernment agreements, as well as buy-in from the public. Elsevier's evidence-based report, Pathways to Net Zero, presents an analysis of a set of over 1.6 million research publications and 800,000 patents published between 2001 and 2020, with the aim of advancing our understanding of clean energy research and innovation and the pathways towards achieving a net zero future. With this urgent context in mind, I will now turn to my colleague, Dr. Basak Candemir, who will share some of the key findings of the report. Basak, over to you, and thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Anne. Well, I would like to start by acknowledging our contributors and collaborators in this report. We work with a large group of collaborators from within the company, but also externally. Most importantly, we had an advisory group of scientific people from across the world who helped us shape the content of this report and sense check our findings. Within the report, you can also find interviews with a number of key opinion leaders, including Ban Ki-moon. In terms of the methodology, as Professor Leon Clark indicates here, defining net zero is a challenge. There are a number of ways that we can define net zero, and we have used one way, acknowledging that there may be other ways. And referred to the SDG publications from Elsevier. We have mapped all the publications in Scopus to 16 of the SDG goals. And in this report, what we have done is we have used SDG 7, which focuses on clean energy, but based on the advice from our advisory group, we also incorporated energy relevant publications from SDG 13, which focuses on climate change. Similar data, as was used in this research, is also available in the engineering village if your institution doesn't have a Scopus subscription. The subfields within net zero energy were also determined bottom up through the use of topic clusters, so publication sets that are formed by citation linkages, rather than defining them top down. The report has overall 11 sections, which I'm not going to go through here, but it goes all the way in terms of the research landscape output, but also focuses on collaboration and corporate elements. And in the remaining part of the presentation, I will focus on a few highlights from the report. To start with, how has the net zero energy research grown since 2001? Well, in 2001, net zero energy publications accounted for 1% of global publications, which rise to 5% as of 2020, which is quite a significant growth. If we look into the countries that have published most in this area, we see that China is the most published country, contributing to 24% of all net zero energy publications in the analysis period, whereas at the same time, it has accounted for only 14% of the global output, showing that it is highly specialized in this area. The most published country globally, the US, on the other hand, contributed to 17% of the publications in net zero energy. On the second column, you can see, well, you cannot read, but we have something called the relative activity again here, focusing on how much the countries are focused on net zero energy compared to their overall global outputs. And we see countries like China, Korea, Taiwan, Malaysia, and Singapore, they are relatively more specialized in net zero energy. This is also not surprising because if we look into the funding, what we see here is Chinese funding agencies were the single largest funders of net zero energy publications by far. And a lot of the funders actually focused on areas such as batteries, photocatalysis, and other areas. The other thing we have observed is a change in the net zero energy publications. Sorry, the net zero energy topics. So if I can zoom here, what you can see here is in 2001, a topic around fusion energy, magnetoplasma, was the most published research area within net zero energy, going down to number 18 in 2020. On the other hand, an area like photocatalysis was number 18 here in 2001, and it went all the way up to number 4 in 2020. What this does show us is priorities and focus areas within net zero have changed. And we also see that the different countries have different specialization patterns as well. Here we see the top 20 topic clusters that were published by China. And we also see the specialization. So the greener it is, the more specialized it is. So if you take, for example, lithium ion, secondary batteries, electric batteries topic cluster, China is relatively 3 times more specialized in this area compared to the world average. If you look into the US, on the other hand, we see that the US is not relatively specialized in any of the top 20 topic clusters it focuses in, except the topic of fusion energy. Another thing that we looked into within our report is the deployment of research, because it takes quite a long time to go from research sometimes to application. We see that the share of net zero energy publications in applied technology domain increased by 20 percentage points throughout the analysis period. We see countries like Singapore, Switzerland, Russia, and Japan focusing more on the basic science aspect of net zero energy, whereas countries like Denmark, Iran, or Malaysia had a higher share of applied technology publications within their net zero energy portfolio. There is also a difference between different topic clusters. So what we see is topic clusters such as lithium-ion batteries or electrocatalysis. They still are a bit farther away from applied technology in terms of the share of publications. But we see other topic clusters such as wind powers or energy economics, photovoltaic cells. They are a bit closer to applied technology. We also looked into the role of corporates. We see corporates as an important player, not because they have a role in achieving net zero by reducing emissions, but also they are critical in bringing key technologies to the market. What we are seeing here is on this side, we are seeing the corporate outputs from the countries. Countries like China, USA, they are the top published in terms of the absolute volume of corporate output. But when we look into the share, we see actually countries like Japan, Switzerland, Netherlands, and Denmark having a relatively larger share of their outputs published by corporates. And we also see China increasing having a very large growth in terms of the corporate output, whereas we see USA, for example, or Japan, Switzerland having a bit of a decline in the analysis period. We also see Saudi Arabia and Malaysia showing high growth, although we have to say they had a very small base to start with. And while the overall output has increased, the share of academic corporate co-publications declined slightly in net zero energy. Academic corporate collaboration was most prevalent in Europe, US, Canada, Japan, and South Korea. We also looked into how did the research translate into patents. And what we see is patent citing net zero energy research increased greatly in the analysis period, dominated by the US, Japan, and Germany. But what we also see here is this is the patent portfolio of the top countries. You can see that the patent portfolio of China has increased considerably. In the last 2 slides, I would like to focus on the policy and media attention. So what we have done is we looked into the research, the linkage between research and policy through using Overton and Plumex's data. And what we have observed is that NetZero received slightly less attention from policymakers, but slightly more attention for online fields. Here, what we are seeing is the countries that have published NØEnergy. And on the left-hand side, what we are seeing is those countries that have cited the research here, including the intergovernmental organizations and EU. So what we are seeing is countries like Germany, the UK, and USA. The research from these countries were heavily cited by policy documents of intergovernmental organizations, EU, the UK, and the USA. I would like to stop here, but would like to encourage you to have a look into the report. It is quite in-depth, and I'm sorry I couldn't cover more of it in this webinar, but we'll be happy also to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Basak and Anne. We really appreciate your insights to this very valuable information. I'm going to launch a second poll, and if you would take just a few seconds to answer that poll. And as Basak had requested, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We do have a few questions that have been entered, so I'm going to ask either of you. The first one is, achieving net zero will depend on interdisciplinary innovation. We've just seen the increase in China's patents for patents related to net zero. How has tracking patent activity and quality informed the broader SDG discussion?
Right. Thanks, Mark. Should I take that, Basak?
Yes, please.
Okay, no worries. I mean, one of the things that we've been seeing, Mark, is the largest contributors to patent innovation are in China and the United States. And when we look at the SDGs as a whole, stepping back from net zero, but looking at all of the SDGs, the US has an estimated 500,000 patents falling into SDG categories. In contrast, China have 1.6 million patents. The largest concentration of patents from China are focused on SDG 9, 11, and 12. And those are all around industry, innovation and infrastructure, and sustainabilities in communities, and responsible consumption and production. The US lags in terms of total raw output, or what we otherwise call patent count. However, if we look at patent quality, we see that the United States has parity in quality of patents across SDGs 9, 11, and 12, as well as highest quality in SDG number 3, good health and well-being. So the overall patent asset value in the US is higher, but China is producing a greater quantity of patents in SDGs and ultimately net zero as well. So it's quite a source for debate. I can say when we presented some of this data to the national academies, it was a bit of a wake-up call.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Anne. And then here is a second question. Can you share a bit more about what the U.S. national academies are doing in the area of net zero specifically?
Sure. I mean, they have really, multiple prongs of engagement, and certainly an overarching goal for the national academies is just to promote awareness of the SDGs more generally. I think we have seen that the US has just lagged other countries in terms of its adoption and putting it into discourse, but we're seeing more of this now as more people really put this forward as a measure of impact. I think it's also worth mentioning now that traditional measures of journal impact or just pure paper impact aren't good enough for the research community anymore. They're looking at ways to really measure what impact their work has on society. But going back to your question about the national academies, in 2021, they undertook a study by the Committee on Accelerating Decarbonization in the United States, and they produced a report, and some of the areas of focus there caught my attention, and they dedicated a lot of research towards producing carbon-free electricity, Our nation needs to double the share of electricity generated by non-carbon emitting sources by at least 75%. The study also looked at electrifying energy services in transportation and buildings and in industry. And 50% of new vehicle sales across all classes should be zero emission vehicles. We're not on track for that yet, but we're getting there. They also had a call for investing in energy efficiency and productivity, and the total energy used by new buildings should be reduced by 50%, a sizable goal. They're also looking at planning, permitting, and building critical infrastructure. And the feeling is the United States should increase overall electrical transmission capacity by 40% in order to better distribute high quality and low cost wind and solar power from where it is generated so it can be used across the country. So we know that there are like unintended consequences of a lot of these noble goals, and you have to have all of the building blocks in place in order for it to work. It's a bit like a jigsaw puzzle, but it's great to partner with the national academies in this regard.
Thank you for that, Anne. I've got a question here, and I respect that you are researchers. I'm going to ask the question, but it could be more of a, well, maybe not fact-based, so let me just ask the question. Do you find that net zero is more based in policy than technology advances?
I think, well, I will start with the short answer. We just don't know yet, but I think this is a really good question because we have the data, we didn't have the time. We have the data to actually, I think, to look into what research areas, policy sites, and then we can compare that with the what I've shown around maturity of research areas. So how has research in specific areas progressed from basic to applied technology going into the market, let's say, and how does, if and how does that correspond with what policy looks into in terms of the research? I think it's a really good question, but I just don't have a database answer. If there are observations though, I'd be keen to hear.
And if I may add, I think this is a good question, and we're looking at the interdependencies between, research and policy, technology and policy. And in fact, we're incorporating, we have a partnership with a company called Overton, which really looks for scientific citations in policy documents. So whereas we have indexed the world of scientific research, they have indexed a world of policy documents. Our sister company, LexisNexis, also does this. So we have spent a good deal of time looking to track science and legislation and in other policy arenas. And this is one of the things that our conversations with federal agencies has really indicated is of great interest to many. It's linking those two things that you just asked about.
Sorry, just one thing that popped to my mind.
You were so excited.
Well, no, it's a very good question, and I'm a little bit gutted that we didn't have the time. But this is just an observation. One thing that we have observed was, for example, if you look into fusion research, which was such a hot topic, you see that it has declined in the last 20 years significantly. And I think, for example, in that case, it should be highly linked to policy because it's it requires large infrastructure and therefore investment. You see, for example, in China, they have this policy and this big, large infrastructure now. Therefore, they have high research in that area as well. But if you look into Europe, funding was decreased, for example, around these large infrastructures. So I think there is some link between policy and research, although causality is a bit more difficult to establish.
Thank you so much. I know we had the right people for this. Thank you so much for your talents, your insights, and for sharing this with us today. Basak, if you could just advance one last slide. I want to thank our audience, who many of you have attended, many in our session. Today is the end of our Spring 2022 series. We're going to take a couple months off, give you a break for the summer, and we'll be sending out a schedule. If there are any of the webinars that you may have wanted to attend but weren't able to, please look for us on YouTube at the Elsevier for Engineering page on YouTube and access the over 45 webinars that we've got there. Again, thank you to our panelists, Basak and Anne. We really appreciate your expertise in sharing it with our audience. And thank you to my colleagues for just a great season and more knowledge shared with our viewers. So thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you kindly for the opportunity.